So by now, hopefully you've got your fueling control set, your ignition controlling set, and your boost control if it is a turbocharged vehicle. And if you're using a package like the R35, the Hurricane 991, pretty much most of our latest packages, or even the VAG stuff, basically the next area to look at before you start going off and driving the car, if it is a DSG car, is the torque control area. Now the torque control area is basically, we report to the transmission ECU the current calculated torque which we're making, then a demanded torque which is based off the pedal, so that it's basically telling the transmission in transient events what to basically do with the clutches. And yeah, and the point of this video is to basically show two ways in which you can set it up, because on the latest firmwares there are some differences to the way that the torque control is done. So this ECU is running 1.599 firmware, and if we scroll down to the torque control, basically you can see there's a few comp maps which we'll explain in a minute. But basically what I want to do is actually run through each area first, so I can explain exactly what each of the map is doing. So the first ones in blue are basically items which need to be programmed to be set. These are not changeable live. Any green items are live, blue are not. So we can see the torque control first is enabled, and then the next items are just the breakpoints where you can set the breakpoints for the different tables. So then what we do is we come to the friction table. Now the friction table is basically reported on some cars to the transmission to basically state the friction torque of the engine. Other cars don't use it, but generally in all the strategies we do set it because it helps to getting the calculated torque into being the right area, because obviously there are friction losses which are applied to a torque calculation from the engine, valve train losses, etc. The next table is the Mbt Torque Estimate. Now, under alternate torque estimation control here, if you've got the use fuel flow to estimate MB torque, then the Mbt torque table, okay, is not used, okay? So what we're going to first do is explain, if that is set to no, then basically the torque values which are sent to the actual transmission actually come off the Mbt Torque Estimate table. Now this is the primary load on this car, because it's 4D calibrated on the Hurricane. It's actually done based on TPS on one axis, RPM on the other, with a manifold pressure multiplier. So basically you can actually input your torque values based on a pedal position, a throttle position, and your RPM to basically send to the transmission. Now while this will work, and in most instances provides a good control, the best thing to actually use is to actually use it on a fuel model, because basically if you know how much fuel you're injecting, and you know the density of the fuel, you know the energy which comes out of the given fuel that you're using, you can actually calculate the torque pretty well once you actually input the injector size and the fuel consumption area. So the point now is what I'm going to do is actually leave the Mbt Torque Estimate table alone. Like I said, you can edit this table live, and you can see that it has no effect to our torque estimation output value, which is here. So if I go normal on here and then normal on the demand, you can actually see I'm changing this table. I put it to 200, and it has no effect on the value which is being outputted here, which is the engine torque output trans. This is the value which is sent out to the transmission. Okay. So basically, then what you've got is multipliers for manifold pressure and air charge temp. These are pretty straightforward. And the same for these custom comp maps which we've got. We've got one that's a multiplier for the torque output per gear, one which is based on the lambda, drive-by-wire target blip, and the engine oil temp. These are just basically all comp maps which we've added to basically try and get the torque calculation on this package to be as close as possible to what we have found on engine dynos and chassis dynos, and also what the transmission works really well with. So let's have a look then. So first thing before we actually talk about this alternative torque estimation is to talk about the parameters which are available in the torque control. So on the right hand side over here, you can actually see the list of all of the variables. So you've got engine torque estimate friction, which I've gone over. Then you've got the engine torque estimate MBT. Now this is the torque value which is being calculated before any friction losses are being applied to it. Then you've got the motor, which again is the same as the MBT, but basically the difference here is that any torque reductions that are applied via any of the strategies like traction control and launch control will be applied onto this calculated torque as well. Then you've got your output, which is the value which is sent out to the transmission, And then you've got your potential and trans, which are also values which are sent out to the transmission. Now the difference between these three values, the engine torque estimate output is basically the same as the motor with the friction applied, okay? So you've got your Mbt value plus minus your friction, okay, equals your output, okay? Now the output potential is again the same as above, Mbt minus friction, but what it doesn't do is when again torque controls like traction control and launch control is applied, it doesn't alter that because it's the potential torque. It's the torque which we're sending to the transmission to say, look, this torque is potentially available even if we are doing any torque reductions, etc. Now the output trans basically is the actual torque, okay, so it's the same as the engine torque estimate output, but the trans version is one which we send out to the transmission that again is the actual, so basically any torque reductions which are present, so if the gearbox is requesting a torque reduction, basically the output trans will show the torque reduction being applied when there's timing reduction or drive-by-wire reduction from the trans request. But if there's any cuts during traction control or launch control, we don't want to update the transmission about that because basically it can have an effect on the clutch pressures which are not always great in certain scenarios. The demand PPS is exactly what I said earlier. It's basically a demanded torque value which is sent. Generally that's based on pedal position because it's a transient event. So if you were to suddenly stamp on the throttle, the demand would go up obviously quickly first before the MBT and hence transmits to the transmission that there has been a transient change in the torque requested, and what it can do is it stiffens up the duty being applied to clutch pressures, etc., touch points. Then you've got engine torque limb. So the engine torque limb is the value which comes from the transmission, okay? Basically, when you do a shift, the transmission sends a torque request of what it would like, and then the ECU then deals with it based on your actual MBT torque. It looks at the torque limb, and basically then between the two, it works out a multiplier to how much to reduce the torque by, which I will go and explain in a minute. Then the other items are basically all again torque limb multipliers, which can come in from other sources. You can have a limiter for the torque based on your pedal position limit. You can have a motor limit where you can set a limit of the torque for a given gear, etc. And then the engine torque limb multiplier is the difference between the actual MBT and the engine torque limb, and that is then used part of the torque calculations. The ignition retard and cut severity then are just reporting how much torque is being reduced. So now we understand what those variables do. The alternative torque estimation, as I explained, is used on this car. So we've got it to enabled, and then what you do then have is a thermal efficiency table, which basically you can plot the actual thermal efficiency of the engine. Now at idle, the engine's thermal efficiency is generally quite poor, but as you obviously come onto load and etc., the engine's thermal efficiency changes. If you want to learn more about that, obviously there is lots of information. If a quick Google search will type in thermal efficiency, it will explain a lot more. The point of this video is not to explain exactly about that, but explain what the calibrations do. And you can read up about that. But generally, the thermal efficiencies that are set in the base maps are actually pretty correct for the engine, which we've actually set. Okay, so the fuel flow. So as I explained, it uses the calculated fuel that is being basically pumped into the engine. So our fuel consumption scaling here in milliliters per second basically states the size of the injectors for how much fuel is flowing through them. So these are direct injection injectors, and a good way of calculating this, if you don't actually know them, is obviously you can look at some of the data logs to see how the mass fuel rates that are doing it. But generally, if you do know the size of the injectors, a nice easy way as a base value to start in here is just to take your injector size in cc and divide it by 60. So once you've added your injector scaling size, you then got your density for the fuel. So if you're using a flex fuel setup, you need to make sure that you have got the fuel composition sensor assigned, and then that way it will change the density and energy density values for the given fuel you're using to update the torque control strategy. So we've got it enabled, and you can see here the engine torque output trans value. As I change the size of the injector size, if I basically put that to 8, you can see the output trans value adjusts. And then if I go in, obviously, jump to the fuel table, and in say increase the fueling here, if I multiply it by 1.3, you'll see the torque value changes as well because of the amount of fuel that is being applied. And it's quite good that this why I prefer to use the auto torque, because during transient events of torque, where fuel is obviously used in the transient part of the transient strategy, the torque control is updated as well, which works nicely. So what we've then got is obviously the main multiplier, so to speak, then for your torque calculation, which is sent to the transmission, is based off the fuel consumption scaler. So what I would say to do, get your torque values in the area of around like say 0 to 10 Newton meters, okay, at idle, okay. And then what you can do is when you're driving around, you can actually change this value live and actually see the effect that it has on the clutches. So what we're going to actually do for this purpose is we're actually going to clear these gauges and then just go gauge add the clutch pressures. So clutch pressure A and clutch pressure B. Going to plot them as a trace, and then we're going to go gauge add engine torque output trans, which is what we're sending to the trans. And then the last one is the engine torque lim, which is the request from the transmission. So what we're going to do, make these a bit bigger so you can easily see what they are. And what we're going to do now is actually have a drive before I actually explain some of the other maps that are down here, to explain, show the effect of what the engine output trans torque has on the transmission in this particular car, and what it does with the shifting. So let's put the car into gear. And you can see there where it just actually changed 1 to 2 just before I get onto the main road, the actual engine torque lim value did actually drop because it shifted gear. Okay, so this has actually got the engine torque calculation fuel consumption set good because it's part of the base map of this particular car. And you can see the clutch pressures crossing over nicely and the engine torque lim values coming in. And you can actually see when you look at the engine torque output trans, you actually see it drop when basically the engine torque lim value comes in. So if I basically explain that a bit more and put it into manual mode so it's a bit easier to see and I can illustrate when I'm actually going to do the change. So basically, if you look at the output engine torque value now, as I shift gear, you'll see it gets dropped down based on the request from the transmission. And you can actually see the clutch pressures be updated to suit. Now, if I now go to my injector and consumption scaling, okay, which is currently set at 14, and actually then just lower this, if you watch the clutch pressure, you'll see it actually change on a transient event because basically the transmission adapts to any changes that it sees with the torque value. But what you'll see now, when I'm actually driving now and shifting gear, you actually see the clutch pressures are lower. And the car does not shift right at all. You'll see now that it goes from 3rd, 4th, and if you look at the RPM, if I just plot that as well, you actually watch the RPM on a shift now, you'll see that it actually flared. You can actually see it on the where it flared, where the clutch pressure was too low on the exchange. So basically what you want to do is, like I said, drive around and you can adjust this value live in order to get the correct feeling of how the transmission feels. And again, if I go the opposite way, if I basically put in here 20, so the torque values are massive. So basically come down a gear. So now, like you can see, it's 7 bar shift, much higher pressure, and that's basically on the actual initial shift. So I put it back to where it was, and again, you can see then the effect that it has. Now, basically, if we were now to go and actually pull the data from the ECU, so go device, read data, and look at exactly a bit more closer what's actually going on. Just put in here shifting. Data. What it will now do is grab the data from the car where we've been shifting, and what we can actually do then is have a look exactly a bit closer at what's actually going on. So it's just extracting it now, and while it's downloading that, let's go back to SCAL to just explain a few more of what some of these tables are doing. So basically, you then got a clamp engine torque estimate value, Now what that does is basically, if you don't want a certain value to be sent to the transmission above, so say if the transmission is programmed to only accept up to say 700 Newton meters, you don't want to be sending out more than that. And if you do send out more than that, what it can do is it can have a nasty effect on the transmission, in terms of the transmission will go into a limp mode because it's seeing too much torque. So generally the clamp values is a nice easy way that you can clamp the values, so no matter how much that it's calculating the fuel as being used on the engine, it doesn't send out any more than that to the transmission. Now, the torque estimate multiplier is what I explained here before. When you open up this gauge here where it says 1, what this is the difference between your engine torque Mbt and your engine torque limb value, okay? So the difference between the two, okay, is then actually fed as a multiplier and then basically plotted on this variable here. So if we come back to S data and then look at the logs now, so we go File, Load Latest Data in SView, and we'll grab the log from us driving around. Let's go Gauge Clear, and then Gauge Add, Channel Add, Clutch Pressures, and then Engine Torque, which aren't actually plotted in here, I don't think. Ah, typical. It's not actually logging them. So what we're actually going to do is we'll actually show you how to grab them. So sconfig, device, get the config that's on the ECU is an easy way to do it, or you can load one. And then I am literally just going to go into torque estimation and then log these variables. So highlight these, set them at 20 Hertz. Same for this one, 20 Hertz, and then the multiplier and ignition retard, 20. You can obviously log it a lot faster, up to 1,000 times a second if you wish. But for the purpose of today, I'll do that here. Engine torque limb. Again, we're going to grab that, and then go basic device. Set the config. So we set the logging config into the ECU. Okay, and those parameters will now be part of the logging. Let's just grab a log. It's easier to explain once you see the log of exactly what's going on. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, let's load that log and then look at exactly what's happening. Okay, so here we got the clutch pressures here, and then let's grab the engine torque output trans and engine torque limb and engine torque Mbt and the multiplier and ignition retard. Okay, so then if you want to just view the items on the right hand side which you have selected, you just go to options, key style toggle, or OK on the keyboard. So here you can see the clutch pressures, the way they're exchanging over is nice, and if you were to plot RPM as well, you can see the RPM is shifting nicely, no flares on the RPM. So what we've got here, so let's take out some of the items like the clutch pressure on this one for the minute, and the engine torque estimate output trans, we'll leave that in there, take that one out, and the retard just for the minute. So basically what you can see here, so the red item here is the output trans value. This is the Newton meters of torque we're reporting to the transmission that we're making at this given point. Then the transmission comes in and says, okay, I would actually, you're making 300 Newton meters, I would actually like you to reduce the torque to 166 Newton meters. And then what happens is the ECU will deal with that based on looking at the difference between your current torque and the target as a multiplier. And what it would do then, it will remove ignition timing to suit. So you can see here the engine torque from the engine has actually been dropped, and you can see after it's basically it's ramping in as a request from the transmission is asking for. And if you were to plot the ignition timing retard, you can see that that's actually doing exactly as we want. So your engine torque limb multiplier, as I explained, the difference between your current Mbt torque and the torque limb value is basically expressed as a multiplier, and then that multiplier is used on this table to basically state how much timing it would like it to remove from the engine, ignition timing, and you can see that being plotted here. Now you can also have it so it does fuel cuts as well, so you can say after this amount of torque multiplier, you can say, okay, then I want to be allowed to use up to cuts. Because basically sometimes if you wanted to reduce more than 0.4 of the current engine's torque, you probably won't be able to do that with timing alone, in which case fuel cuts will be needed. So you can basically then do that by setting your cut severity here. You can also do as an open loop add-on for that as well. You can actually have, based on your engine torque limb, if you find that your transmission is the transmission is requesting basically the torque to be reduced, but actually it's still you find the clutches is not man enough to handle the torque that you need, and you need to drop the torque even more, you can actually override that yourself by basically going to like the minimum cut table, and with your engine torque limb axis here and your current pedal position, you can actually apply a cut severity on top of that as well. The other items that are in here, this is just the option to enable it to reduce torque based on the engine torque limb value. Then you've got a pedal position limit where you can basically plot the pedal to be reduced, i.e. drive-by-wire, based on your engine torque limb request and your current pedal position. Then you've got a rate of increase max, which is after the engine torque limb value is dropped off. It's a rate of increase for the pedal after you start moving again, after the engine torque limb is removed again. Then the minimum cut we just explained, and then you've got a shift event detection torque threshold. So when the engine torque limb value is less than this, then the strategy just says, okay, we've got a torque shift detection active, and then hence it will then employ the torque controls that we explained in ignition retard and that. You've got a cut defer time, so basically if you are using it to be based off the pedal position, so you're lowering the pedal position, what you can do is if you might not want it to do any cuts or ignition retard if you are doing it via the pedal, so you can have a defer time to basically say after this amount of time, once the torque has been reduced by the pedal, then you can actually allow the retard and cut to be present. A timeout pedal position, basically what this is for is to say that if you're above 40% pedal and the engine torque limb is on for more than this amount of time, we can actually ignore it and then ramp out the torque release per 10 milliseconds. Generally, reason for this, you might find on certain cars that the gear is already shifted, the shift fork's in, the clutch pressure is up maximum and that, but the transmission, because it's designed for an OEM car where they're wanting to basically increase the longevity of all the parts, they might have the torque reduction on for a long time after the shift is incurred to basically smoothen out the shift. But if you're in a race environment where you're basically wanting to get the car to shift as fast as possible on the drag strip, you don't want, after that gear is in and the next clutch is in and it's not slipping, you don't want any more torque reduction, so you can have a timeout to basically ignore it if you wanted to. And then you've got a limp mode threshold to basically say that if the engine torque limb was on for longer than, say, this value for 2,000 milliseconds, above 80%, then what you can do is put it into a limp mode to say that there's something wrong with the transmission, etc. What you can also do is have a custom Pomp Map on this as well, where it looks at the output shaft and input shafts, and basically between the differences of them you can actually set up a clutch slip variable as well, which I will show in another video.